Tired of feeling overwhelmed by distractions? You're not alone. In fact, you're probably swimming in them right now. Pings from your phone, unread messages, that email you keep meaning to reply to. And still, somewhere deep inside, you're craving peace. Craving focus. What if the key wasn't forward, but backward? The key to unlocking your productivity might lie in the forgotten writing habits of the 19th century. Discover the techniques used by literary giants to conquer distractions and achieve a level of focus that seems almost mythical in today's digital age. Struggling to stay focused in a world that constantly demands your attention? This journey reveals how 19th century writers tackled distraction and achieved remarkable focus, offering practical tips you can implement in your own life, without needing to move into a forest cabin or swear off technology forever. Imagine candlelight flickering against ink-stained paper, the creak of a wooden chair, a kettle warming on the stove. No phones. No pop-ups. Just intention and the page. You probably won't know this, but some of the most brilliant minds in literature owed their clarity to a shockingly boring routine. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video if it brought you a little peace, and if you'd like to join us again, we'd love to have you back. Subscribe when you're ready. No pressure, just rest. Share something if you feel like it. Let's slowly drift into tonight's quiet moments together. You roll out of bed a little earlier than usual, the sun not quite awake, the world still holding its breath. The floor is cold beneath your feet. That's how it starts, just like it did for many 19th century writers. Before words, before inspiration, there's a ritual. A pattern. A quiet groove carved into the start of the day. Take Leo Tolstoy, for instance. Before embarking on the mental marathon of war and peace, he would wake at dawn, take a short walk, and settle into his writing before the household stirred. There was coffee. There was quiet. There was a window facing the fields. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even that glamorous. But it worked. You don't have to be Tolstoy. But you can steal his rhythm. Morning routines are more than productivity hacks, they're cognitive cues. A 2017 study in the Journal of Behavioral Neuroscience found that predictable daily patterns reduce anxiety and increase sustained attention. Your brain loves a plan. It relaxes when it knows what comes next. That's the real secret behind many 19th century routines. They weren't chasing motivation. They were building containers for it. Whether it was the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning waking at 6 a.m. to sit in bed with her notebooks, or Anthony Trollope timing his morning sessions with a watch to produce 250 words every 15 minutes, they weren't waiting for inspiration. They summoned it, habitually. Here's something interesting. Trollope also worked a full-time job at the post office. Yep, one of the most prolific Victorian novelists had a day job that started at 9 a.m. and didn't stop him from writing 47 novels. Why? Because his morning routine protected his focus like a shield. There remains considerable disagreement about whether strict routines enhance creativity or stifle it. Some psychologists argue that creativity thrives on chaos, that structure can hem in innovation. Others, like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who coined flow, suggest the opposite, that deep creativity needs a frame to flourish within. Think of it like jazz. You improvise inside the beat. But let's go back to you. Your mornings probably don't involve inkpots or candle wax. They might involve commute prep, kids, endless notifications. And yet, there's still something you can borrow from those 19th century minds, a short, sacred block of stillness. Even 15 minutes counts. Set the phone to airplane mode. Step outside with your coffee. Or open your journal before you check your email. Let that tiny act signal your brain, now, we focus. No fanfare needed. Just a quirky detail. Gustave Flaubert reportedly didn't begin writing until 1 or 2 in the afternoon, but he spent his entire morning preparing for it. Walking, reading, pacing in circles while muttering about verbs. His routine wasn't early, but it was deeply consistent. You may not have a housekeeper bringing you breakfast or an attic study with velvet drapes, but you do have moments of predictability. Lean into them. Reclaim them. Even one small repetitive action, lighting the same candle, starting at the same time, using the same mug, can become a mental shortcut to clarity. Think of it like tuning an instrument. You wouldn't perform with a guitar still out of pitch. Likewise, don't expect your mind to play well without a little tuning first. And it doesn't have to be serious. Charles Darwin, when he wasn't revolutionizing science, had a delightfully odd morning routine. He took a walk around his garden, thinking path, counted steps, and then read letters from old friends. One of those steps might have literally led to the theory of natural selection. So take a breath. Let your eyes soften. And picture it, an old desk, a quiet corner, the same warm light every morning. You don't need to live in the past to learn from it. The patterns of 19th century writers weren't mystical, they were mundane. But those mundane rituals became the scaffolding for some of the most profound ideas in human history. And that soft regularity? That gentle rhythm? It's the first key to pulling your mind out of chaos and into calm. That shift in energy leads us into something else. You sit, pen or keyboard at the ready, but your mind wanders, to laundry, to that thing someone said 2 weeks ago, to snacks. Focus is slippery. But here's where 19th century writers really shine. They didn't see writing as a race or a hustle. They treated it more like a meditation, something sacred, slow, and absorbing. Take Emily Dickinson, for example. She wrote from her bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts, often in the early morning or late at night. Her poems are brief, compressed like thoughts caught mid-breath. But what's fascinating is how she approached the act itself. Not as a profession. Not as performance. But as communion. She wasn't trying to produce. She was trying to listen. This is where modern psychology steps in. The act of writing, especially reflective, free-form writing, has been shown to mimic the neurological patterns of mindfulness. A study from the University of Texas found that expressive writing activates the same brain regions involved in emotion regulation and introspection. Translation: writing calms the chaos. You might find this surprising. Victor Hugo wrote standing up, using a special high desk and wrapping himself in a giant shawl. He'd sometimes lock away his clothes to stop himself from leaving the house, forcing himself to stay put and write. Slightly dramatic? Yes. But also deeply meditative in its intent, removing all barriers between him and the page. That's what focus can feel like. Not sharp-edged tension, but soft immersion. Like slipping underwater where everything goes quiet. There remains considerable disagreement about whether writing should be treated as a mindful practice or a technical skill. Some schools teach it like carpentry: cut, trim, polish. Others say it's more like yoga: breathe, release, flow. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But the 19th century greats? They leaned into the meditation. Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick, would sometimes spend hours scribbling on scraps of paper while staring out to sea. Not necessarily writing for publication. Just writing to write. He believed the mind needed to wander before it could dive. That's a useful model for you. Instead of chasing productivity, try thinking of writing, or any focused task, as a meditative space. Not a to-do, but a to-be. The poet John Keats trained as a surgeon before turning full-time to writing. And what connected those two paths for him? Focus. He described both surgery and poetry as acts requiring unremitting attention to a single object. Imagine wielding that kind of mental steadiness in your daily life. Now, try this. Before your next creative session, close your eyes for 1 minute. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Then, instead of jumping into work mode, begin gently. Open a notebook and write without stopping for 5 minutes. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to move. You'll notice something start to shift. That's the meditative state 19th century writers knew instinctively. They didn't have mindfulness apps or breathing trackers. But they had the slow hush of paper, the scratch of pen, the silence of being with themselves. Even their writing spaces reflected this. No bright fluorescent lights. No dual monitor setups. Just a table, a chair, maybe a window. Nathaniel Hawthorne once wrote in the same chair for so long that it formed grooves where his arms rested. A kind of literal muscle memory of meditation. You don't need a special setup. But you do need permission, to be quiet, to slow down, to see focus not as a demand, but as a gift. There's a reason even modern therapeutic practices use writing as a tool. Journaling, gratitude lists, morning pages, these are all echoes of what 19th century writers were doing naturally. And the payoff? A softer, more spacious mind. A random tidbit for you. The Bronte sisters wrote most of their early poems and novels in tiny script to save paper, and they'd read their drafts aloud to each other while walking in circles around the dining table. It wasn't rushed. It was ritual. Let that be a lesson. Maybe your focus isn't broken. Maybe it's just tired of being squeezed. So, try writing, or any creative task, as meditation. No judgment. No rush. Just presence. Let the process slow you down. Let the words become breath. Let your mind do what it was designed to do, drift, return, deepen. And as you let that calm take hold, the next layer opens. You close the door. Or maybe you don't even have to, because the quiet around you is thick enough to feel. There's a stillness that wraps the room, a hush that presses gently against your ears. This is solitude, not loneliness, not isolation, but intentional, chosen quiet. And for 19th century writers, it was the bedrock of focus. Take Henry David Thoreau, sitting in his tiny cabin by Walden Pond. He wasn't just escaping society, he was narrowing the aperture of his attention. One chair for solitude, two for friendship, he said. That tells you everything about his priorities. Thoreau believed that to write clearly, to think deeply, you first had to get away from the noise. Today, solitude can feel indulgent. Or even suspicious. You might hear, "You're being antisocial," or "Why aren't you responding?" But back then, solitude was seen as a kind of discipline. A tool. A way to create a buffer around one's thoughts. And the psychology backs it up. A 2014 study from the University of Virginia found that people left alone with their thoughts, even for just 6 to 15 minutes, often grew uncomfortable. Some participants preferred receiving mild electric shocks over sitting in silence. Yes, shocks. That's how allergic we've become to stillness. Here's something that might surprise you. Emily Bronte, who gave us Wuthering Heights, was known to disappear into the moors for hours, sometimes with no explanation. She found company in wind, stones, and clouds. Her family thought she was odd, but those solitary walks fed a mind that created one of literature's most haunting landscapes. There remains considerable disagreement about whether solitude enhances or hinders creativity. Some argue that we need others to sharpen our ideas. Others insist that the truest insights arrive only in stillness. But the 19th century writers? They knew that to hear your own voice, you sometimes have to block out the rest of the world. And not just for an hour. Many lived lives deliberately shaped around solitude. Marcel Proust famously lined his bedroom with cork to muffle sound. He'd sleep during the day and write at night, avoiding daylight and conversation as much as possible. It wasn't eccentricity, it was engineering. He built his life to protect his focus. A weird but true tidbit, Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish essayist and historian, had a soundproof study designed with double doors and thick carpets because he couldn't stand the sound of his neighbor's rooster. The room became almost legendary, and his productivity soared, though, fun fact, the rooster reportedly survived. So, how can you invite that kind of solitude into your life without moving to the woods or investing in soundproofing? It starts with boundaries. Maybe it's a "do not disturb" sign on your door. Maybe it's a timer that tells the world, "I'm gone for 25 minutes." Maybe it's as simple as telling your group chat, "back in an hour." Need brain time. You don't owe constant accessibility to anyone. In fact, some of your most meaningful thoughts are waiting patiently behind the noise. There's also a difference between outer solitude and inner solitude. Even in a noisy apartment or a bustling cafe, you can create pockets of psychological stillness. Headphones. Familiar music. Repetitive motion, like knitting, or even doodling, can lull your mind into calm. You don't have to escape the world to find solitude. You just have to decline its invitation for a while. And remember, solitude doesn't mean seriousness. Louisa May Alcott reportedly wrote Little Women in a flurry of isolated writing sessions, sometimes scribbling furiously on napkins or paper scraps when she escaped to a corner. Alone didn't mean solemn, it meant free. Frederick Douglass, who taught himself to read and write in secret as a child, spoke often of the power of silence. He saw it as resistance, as self-ownership. His time alone was when he sharpened his thinking, deepened his convictions, and crafted the speeches that would later shake the conscience of a nation. So whether your solitude comes wrapped in silence or headphones, in a quiet park or behind a closed bedroom door, honor it. It's not an absence. It's an arrival. A slow settling into the sound of your own mind. And in that stillness, between the tick of the clock and the hum of your thoughts, you might find something you didn't expect, a focus that doesn't feel forced, but invited. As your mind drifts deeper, another layer opens. You're sitting quietly, finally alone, but focus still won't come. The silence is there, but your mind keeps skipping like a scratched vinyl. What's missing? Often, it's anchoring. A tether. Something sensory to keep you grounded in the now. That's a trick 19th century writers mastered without ever using the word mindfulness. They knew how to turn the body's senses into a kind of compass for attention. And even if they didn't have brain scans or focus apps, their rituals, those tiny repeated touches, smells, and textures, worked like gentle anchors pulling them into the present moment. Charles Dickens, for example, wrote in a room filled with specific objects, a vase of fresh flowers, a certain blue ink, a particular paperweight shaped like a dog. He didn't just like those things, they were sensory cues. When he touched that paperweight, he was on. Focus engaged. Modern psychology has a term for this, embodied cognition. A 2020 paper from the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences highlights how physical sensations, like the texture of paper or the scent of a candle, can activate associated memories and mental states. You can literally smell yourself into a more focused mindset. Did you know Victor Hugo allegedly had a special woolen writing shawl that he wore only while composing? It was itchy. Deliberately. The sensation helped jolt his focus whenever it began to drift. Who needs caffeine when your shoulders are tingling? There remains considerable disagreement about whether these sensory triggers are learned or innate. Are we born with sensory pathways linked to attention? Or do we create those links through repeated association? Either way, the 19th century writers leaned in hard. Emily Dickinson often wrote in pencil on scraps of envelope paper, folded into unique shapes. The tactile feel of the paper, the sound of graphite, these weren't distractions. They were part of the experience. Her poems became physical objects as much as mental ones. And let's talk about sound. Not just silence, sound. Nathaniel Hawthorne liked the quiet scratch of quill on paper. Louisa May Alcott reportedly liked the distant clatter of the kitchen downstairs while she wrote in the attic. Rhythmic, domestic, faintly comforting. That's another sensory anchor, sound that signals, focus is safe here. So how do you find your anchors? Start small. Maybe it's a particular candle scent you light only when doing deep work. Maybe it's a certain playlist, one without lyrics, or a cup of tea in a specific mug. These aren't indulgences. They're tools. The more you pair them with focused effort, the more they become like psychic triggers, time to drop in. And don't overlook texture. Some writers, like George Eliot, insisted on soft blankets or firm-backed chairs. Others needed the click of a mechanical pencil or the weight of a fountain pen. The feel of a thing can call your attention back like a whisper on your skin. A weird little bonus? Mark Twain reportedly had a collection of cats that he let roam freely in his writing room. The soft purring and fur brushing against his legs became part of the writing experience, like a real-time, live-action stress reliever. And it's not just about calming the senses. Sometimes, stimulation helps. An open window with a breeze. The roughness of linen against your arm. Even chewing gum, studies suggest, can improve sustained attention by keeping your mouth just active enough to anchor your thoughts. Yes, really. Now, there's a balance here. Too much sensory input and you cross into distraction. Too little, and your mind starts floating into the void. The sweet spot? A handful of chosen, familiar, grounding details. Think of them as your cognitive campfire, small flames to keep you warm and focused without setting the house on fire. You might not have a study lined with cork or a shawl that smells like ink and ambition. But maybe you have your favorite sweatshirt. A chair that hugs your back just right. A certain Spotify playlist called Rainy Cafe that tells your brain, we're about to focus. That counts. It all counts. And if you're someone who fidgets, lean into it. Charles Darwin used to spin geological specimens in his hand while thinking. Little rocks, big ideas. Fidget cubes and worry stones are just the modern echoes of that old instinct. Give the hand something to do so the mind can go deeper. And this works across disciplines, not just for writers. Anyone doing focused work, coding, designing, studying, can use sensory anchors. It's not about copying 19th century rituals perfectly. It's about finding the ones that translate. So here's your experiment. Choose one anchor today. A sound. A scent. A sensation. Use it during your next focused session. And only then. Over time, you'll notice your brain begin to respond faster. The cue becomes a shortcut. Focus arrives not with force, but with familiarity. The issue has sparked significant intellectual debate. Should modern workspaces be tailored to our senses, or should we train ourselves to ignore sensory distractions? Minimalists argue for clean, empty desks. Others say our brains need texture and warmth to engage. But again, the 19th century writers offer a quiet middle path. Surround yourself with a few meaningful things. Not clutter. Just comfort. So let your senses lead. Let your fingertips, your nose, your ears help guide your mind. The body knows how to focus, if we give it the right cues. And with those cues in place, the rhythm shifts again, this time into movement. You step outside, maybe just for a moment. The air touches your skin, cool or warm, doesn't matter, it's different. You walk. At first, slowly. Your mind's still buzzing. But then something happens. Your steps begin to fall into rhythm. Thoughts untangle themselves. Ideas rearrange like migrating birds. That's not a coincidence. That's the walk working on you. For 19th century writers, walking wasn't exercise, it was focus in motion. Let's start with Charles Dickens. He walked up to 20 miles a day. Not brisk power walking with earbuds and a water bottle, no, he wandered. Through London streets, into its alleys, through parks and markets. Those walks weren't breaks from writing. They were writing. He collected character ideas, overheard dialogue, observed every little twitch of humanity. Modern psychology backs him up. A 2014 Stanford study found that walking boosts creative output by an average of 60%. Why? Movement activates brain regions involved in memory recall and ideation. The act of walking, especially in nature or open spaces, shifts your brain into what's called transient hypofrontality, a state where your inner critic quiets down and free association takes over. Here's something delightful. William Wordsworth is believed to have walked over 180,000 miles during his lifetime. That's 7 laps around the earth, on foot. He composed much of his poetry aloud as he strolled through the Lake District. His sister Dorothy would walk with him, quietly jotting down verses as he spoke them. There remains considerable disagreement about whether movement distracts from deep thought or enhances it. Some cognitive scientists argue that stillness is necessary for sustained attention. But others, particularly those studying embodied cognition, believe that moving the body actually stabilizes the mind. For the 19th century writers, the answer was clear: walk first, write better. And it wasn't always pastoral bliss. Soren Kierkegaard stormed through the streets of Copenhagen, flapping his coat, muttering philosophical musings. He said he couldn't think without walking. He needed the motion. The friction. It was like winding up a watch inside his head. Here's something interesting. Louisa May Alcott's family, especially her father, Bronson, believed so deeply in the connection between walking and focus that they built walking paths into their home design. Seriously. Instead of traditional hallways, they included meandering indoor walking loops. Imagine that next time you're pacing your apartment. So, how can you use this in your world? Start with 5 minutes. No phone. No destination. Just go. Walk down your street. Around your block. Even in circles around your living room if you must. The goal isn't steps, it's rhythm. Let your body lead. Let your mind soften. And if you can get into nature, even better. The Japanese practice of shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, isn't just poetic, it's science-backed. Trees emit phytoncides, airborne chemicals that reduce cortisol and boost concentration. The 19th century writers didn't know that term, but they felt it. Think of Henry James, who would pace through his garden dictating novels to his secretary. Or Ralph Waldo Emerson, who took long walks through Concord, Massachusetts, returning with a jacket full of leaves and a brain full of epiphanies. A small, quirky twist: Gustave Flaubert had such an intense walking ritual that he wore down the floorboards in his writing room. He'd stomp back and forth, rehearsing sentences aloud in a booming voice, until the exact rhythm clicked. Writing, for him, was physical. If you're stuck on a problem, get up. Walk. Not because it's a productivity tip, but because it's how your mind wants to move. We evolved to think while moving. The modern office, the desk, the long stares at screens, that's the anomaly. Not walking. You don't even have to be thinking hard while you walk. In fact, it's better if you're not. Let your gaze go soft. Let your ears take in sounds. Let your feet find their own beat. That background hum in your brain? That's where your best ideas hide. And walking works across all types of focus, not just for writers. Artists. Designers. Scientists. Even composers. Ludwig van Beethoven took a walk after lunch every day, carrying a pen and paper for melody ideas. Something about that motion unlocked patterns he couldn't find sitting still. Philosophers have long debated the nature of thinking. Is it purely mental, or does the body participate? The 19th century writers made no such distinction. Their feet, hands, and lungs were just as involved in focus as their minds. Thought, for them, was a full-body experience. So here's a practical invitation: schedule a thinking walk this week. Nothing fancy. Just you, a notebook, and motion. Let the rhythm carry you. Don't force it. Let the brain catch up when it's ready. Trust that those old patterns, the ones that worked for Dickens and Wordsworth, still work. Because they do. And as you find your pace, a different kind of order emerges, one that invites you to build structure around the chaos. You come back from that walk feeling clearer, like your thoughts finally lined up and shook hands. And now, it's time to sit. Not just anywhere, not just anytime. Here's where the 19th century writers whisper their next lesson: structure is not the enemy of creativity. It's the invitation. Today we call it time blocking. Then, it was just life. But it's uncanny how many of those writers created strict schedules long before productivity planners and Google Calendar ever existed. They built routines not because they loved rigidity, but because they understood that deep focus doesn't show up randomly. It needs a container. Take Anthony Trollope. His method sounds like a dare. He wrote in 15-minute increments, aiming for 250 words every block. If he finished a novel early in a writing session, he immediately began the next one in the same sitting, no breaks, no fuss. That kind of focus seems mythical now, but for him it was logistics. He had a day job with the post office. Writing time had to fit, not sprawl. Modern psychology has caught up to this. Research from the Journal of Experimental Psychology shows that when we assign time slots to specific tasks, especially ones that demand cognitive energy, we're far more likely to complete them without drifting. It's not just about discipline, it's about protecting mental bandwidth. Just a quirky detail, Victor Hugo scheduled his writing between 6 a.m. and 11 a.m., and instructed his valet to hide his clothes so he couldn't leave the house. Not metaphorically. Literally. He'd write in a blanket until the words were done. That's time blocking with teeth. There remains considerable disagreement about whether time blocking limits spontaneity. Some argue that overplanning kills the spark of intuition. Others point out that creative breakthroughs happen within structured hours, not outside them. The 19th-century writers? They weren't waiting for a muse to strike. They were showing up at the desk whether she came or not. Even the Romantics had structure. Percy Bysshe Shelley, though known for his emotional intensity, wrote every morning between 10 and noon. Afternoons were reserved for walking, letters, or reading. It wasn't rigid, it was rhythmic. And rhythm is the key here. Not micromanagement. You don't have to map every 5-minute window. But you do need anchors. 1 hour each morning. A half hour every night. Protected. Regular. Even if you don't feel like it. Because feelings are fickle. But habits? They build cathedrals. Here's something that might surprise you. George Eliot wrote Middlemarch in carefully protected windows of time, supported by a household that respected those boundaries. She structured her mornings for composition, her afternoons for editing and correspondence. Friends knew not to interrupt. Even the maid tiptoed. Maybe your house isn't so cooperative. Maybe your life is less linen and more laundry. Still, you can carve focus out of chaos. It starts with naming your blocks. You don't need a planner. A post-it note on your monitor will do. From 8 to 9 a.m., you write. From 3 to 3:30, you read. Repeat it. Honor it. Let the repetition become sacred. And don't panic if a block gets disrupted. Trollope was once asked what he did when inspiration didn't come. He said, "I still wrote." His job wasn't to feel inspired. It was to show up. Philosophers still argue whether human attention is best managed through external structure or internal self-regulation. Should you build a system or train your willpower? The 19th century mind seemed to say, why not both? Build the frame, then grow inside it. Now, this doesn't mean hustle harder. In fact, many of these writers included rest in their block system. William Wordsworth had writing blocks and walking blocks. Jane Austen would help with chores between morning and evening writing sessions. Structure didn't mean pressure. It meant clarity. And there's something deeply calming about knowing what comes next. Your brain stops hovering in decision fatigue. That nagging little voice, what should I be doing? Gets quiet. You're doing this. Now. That's enough. One of those odd facts, Alexander Dumas color-coded his time blocks using different paper colors, blue for fiction, pink for nonfiction, yellow for poetry. His desk looked like a rainbow exploded, but it kept his brain in sync with his schedule. You can create your own signals. Maybe you write better with a certain playlist. Maybe you set alarms named Brain Dive or Do the Thing. Maybe you change your shirt when it's writing time, even if you don't leave the house. Small actions make big anchors. If you're someone who struggles with procrastination, and let's be real, who doesn't, time blocking is your friend. It breaks the scary wall of, I have so much to do, into gentle windows. I'll just write for 25 minutes. That's it. Nothing heroic. But it's how books get written. How ideas become real. So, here's your challenge, pick 2 blocks this week. Write them down. Protect them. Tell someone if it helps. Use them for something that matters, not the laundry, not the inbox, not the feed. Something yours. Because when time has shape, your thoughts can stretch. And once you've built that structure, it's time to go deeper, into the fine, slow mechanics of the hand. Your fingers hover over the keyboard, muscles twitching with modern impatience. You're ready to type, to tap something fast and legible, something that can be backspaced and autocorrected and rewritten on the fly. But imagine, just for a moment, if you had no delete key. Just ink. Just paper. Just the weight of every word as it landed. Welcome to the handwriting era. For 19th century writers, writing wasn't a click-clack flurry, it was a full-body ritual. Dip the pen. Shake the excess ink. Press the nib to paper. Pause. Begin again. It was slow, sure, but that slowness wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. It demanded focus. Take Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. She wrote the first drafts of her Gothic masterpiece by hand in small, careful cursive. Not because it was poetic. Because it was the only option. And yet, her letters describe how handwriting helped her dwell in the thought more completely. Every stroke was an act of staying present. Fast forward to today. A 2020 study in Frontiers in Psychology found that handwriting activates neural pathways involved in memory consolidation, spatial awareness, and sensory-motor integration, more so than typing. That means handwriting doesn't just record your thoughts. It shapes them. Not what you'd guess, but true. Friedrich Nietzsche, toward the end of his life, used a writing ball, a prototypewriter, to save his eyesight. But he said it changed his style. Our writing tools are also working on our thoughts, he wrote. Tools shape the voice. They shape the speed. They shape the depth. There remains considerable disagreement about whether writing by hand is necessary in the digital age. Some say it's obsolete, a charming relic. Others argue it's an irreplaceable brain-body feedback loop. The 19th century writers wouldn't have debated it. They lived it. And the focus it forced on them left marks, not just on pages, but in the texture of their thinking. Something unexpected you'll want to know, George Sand wrote in bed, with pages spread across her knees, inkpot nestled beside her. She often drafted entire novels this way. Her writing had a distinctive lean, a rhythm that came from balancing comfort with control. And she did it all by hand, in long unbroken stretches. There's a different kind of focus in handwriting. Fewer distractions. No tabs to flip between, no notifications to silence, no blue light blinking. Just you and the page. The brain slows to match the speed of the hand. And in that slowing, something unexpected happens, the noise drops away. A detail that might make you smile. Thomas Hardy used a fountain pen he called the Beast. It was heavy, messy, and often leaked, but he refused to replace it. He said it kept him alert. It requires obedience, he once joked. But what he really meant was that it demanded attention. Handwriting also carries mood, energy, hesitation. You can see the thought process. Crossouts, arrows, margin notes. A typed sentence looks clean. A handwritten one looks lived in. Even editing becomes a different process. Jane Austen often stitched pieces of paper together, literally glued extensions onto her drafts, to keep her revisions attached. She didn't erase. She expanded. That's a metaphor if there ever was one. And it's not about being old-fashioned. Many modern creatives still write longhand when they need to think deeply. Quentin Tarantino, J.K. Rowling, and Neil Gaiman all start by hand. Why? Because it slows the brain to focus. Because the words feel real. Try this. For your next idea, don't open a Google document, grab a notebook. Write the first 5 sentences by hand. Use a pen that feels satisfying. Don't aim for beauty. Aim for presence. Feel the friction of the page. Notice how your thoughts take on texture. Philosophers have long debated the nature of thought, whether it is primarily verbal or physical. Does the hand merely record what the brain thinks, or does it help the brain think? For the 19th century writers, the question never needed asking. Their hands were their minds. One fed the other. And it wasn't just about letters and novels. Handwritten diaries were a lifeline. Charlotte Bronte's journal entries sometimes read like half-dreams, scratched in hurried script, emotions surging through the pen. Those pages weren't performance, they were privacy. Focus, not for the world, but for the self. The tactile feedback of handwriting builds memory. Students who handwrite notes retain more information than those who type, according to several educational studies. The act of forming each letter encodes the thought more deeply. Focus becomes muscle memory. So maybe you won't handwrite your whole novel or thesis. That's okay. But maybe the beginning, the brainstorming, the big messy heart of it, maybe that part deserves ink. Not because it's quaint, but because it helps you feel the shape of your own thoughts. Here's your gentle prompt: find one notebook. Not for perfection. For presence. Make it your focus journal. Keep it nearby. When the mind spins, when the screen overwhelms, write a few lines by hand. Anchor yourself to the page. Because in that slow, physical connection, where pen meets paper and thought meets texture, you might find the kind of attention no screen can offer. And once you've dipped into the depth of your handwriting, you're ready to explore what happens when limits actually free your focus. You sit in your favorite spot. The light isn't perfect. The chair's a little stiff. You're using a pen that skips if you press too hard. And yet, something sharpens. Your mind settles in, not in spite of these limitations, but because of them. That's a paradox the 19th century writers knew well. Sometimes, constraints are the doorway to deeper focus. We live in a world that worships convenience, ergonomic chairs, perfect playlists, infinite digital storage. But 19th century authors didn't have those luxuries. Instead, they worked inside very real boundaries: dim lighting, limited paper, cold rooms, tight schedules. And somehow, those limitations didn't stunt their output. They sharpened it. Take Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote many of his stories in a tiny, poorly lit room, sometimes using the backs of previous manuscripts. He often complained about money, drafts lost in the mail, and ink shortages. But he also produced some of the most meticulously structured tales in literary history. Why? Because he learned to work inside the box, and let it frame his creativity. Modern psychology calls this the creative constraint principle. A 2019 study in the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition found that people perform better on problem-solving tasks when given clear, specific limits. Counterintuitive, right? But limitations force the brain to focus. Too many choices, and you drown in possibility. Fewer choices? Suddenly, you get inventive. Jane Austen wrote most of her novels on a small 12-sided writing table in a shared room, often surrounded by her family. No study. No silence. She kept a loose piece of paper nearby to cover her manuscript whenever someone walked in. Somehow, she still wrote Pride and Prejudice. There remains considerable disagreement about whether constraints enhance or inhibit creativity. Minimalists argue that boundaries streamline thought. Maximalists claim that total freedom is the only way to innovate. But for 19th century writers, the constraints weren't optional, they were reality. And yet, those realities gave birth to greatness. Think of Emily Bronte, who used a single notebook to write over 100 poems, reusing paper, writing between lines, squeezing thoughts into margins. That scarcity gave her work a sense of urgency, of rawness. Every line mattered. A weird little bonus: Gustave Flaubert, ever the perfectionist, was known to spend an entire day on a single sentence. He called it le mot juste, the exact word. Sometimes it wasn't inspiration that guided him, but the limits of language itself. He didn't see that as a burden. He saw it as precision. So how does this apply to you? Start by creating some purposeful constraints. Turn off your Wi-Fi for an hour. Write in a notebook instead of a laptop. Limit yourself to 1 cup of coffee before noon. Or give yourself 500 words, no more, no less, to express an idea. These aren't punishments. They're invitations. It's like jazz improvisation. The structure isn't a cage. It's a canvas. The boundaries give shape to the freedom. And if you think constraints will cramp your vision, consider this. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during a literal challenge. She, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron were stuck indoors during a gloomy summer in Geneva. They dared each other to write ghost stories. Her story, born from boredom, rain, and friendly limits, became a literary landmark. Even tools became limits that focused the mind. Fountain pens ran out of ink. Paper had a cost. Light faded with the sun. These weren't distractions, they were timers. External reminders to focus, finish, and move on. Try setting a rule for your next creative task: 1 hour, 1 scene, no editing. Or 1 sketch per page, no erasing. Or 3 bullet points only, no PowerPoint. See how your brain reacts. You might feel a little panic at first. But then, clarity. Philosophers still argue whether form should follow function, or vice versa. Should art, or focus, flow freely, or should it fit a mold? The 19th century writers seem to answer with a shrug: give me what you've got, I'll make it work. And they did. Over and over again. Constraints also created ritual. Charles Dickens would begin each writing session with 5 specific objects arranged just so. He didn't need 100 perfect tools. He needed 5. Familiar. Reassuring. Limitations that told his brain, this is writing time. You can do the same. Choose 1 pen. 1 desk. 1 app. Use it for a week. Not because it's ideal, but because the lack of variety becomes a path to deeper attention. Fewer decisions means more focus. It's not deprivation, it's devotion. A random tidbit for you: Herman Melville wrote parts of Moby Dick while working at a customs house, scribbling notes between inspections. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He worked within his limits. And he turned those limits into literature. So here's your next small experiment: set a boundary. Any boundary. Word count. Time. Tools. Space. See how it reshapes your process. You might hate it at first. That's fine. But notice, did your thoughts sharpen? Did your focus hold longer? Because sometimes, the clearest thoughts live not in the open field, but in the narrow path. And once you've built that respect for the boundary, it's time to step outside it, into the green, whispering places that 19th century writers walked for renewal and clarity. You walk into the green. Maybe it's a real garden, or maybe just a memory. Leaves brushing your sleeve. The smell of dirt, pine, or even just damp stone. And your mind exhales. That's not poetic coincidence. That's biology. That's focus being restored, exactly how 19th century writers intended it. For them, nature wasn't an aesthetic. It was a cognitive reset. A laboratory for thought. A sacred space for clarity. They didn't just walk through it, they lived in it. And they understood, centuries before the research confirmed it, that natural environments cleanse the mental palate like nothing else. Take Henry David Thoreau. He didn't just write about Walden Pond, he built his entire writing life around it. His cabin in the woods wasn't a quirky detour. It was a focused design choice. A commitment to removing noise and returning the mind to something more essential. Birdsong instead of gossip. Trees instead of timelines. Modern science agrees. A 2015 study published in Nature showed that spending just 90 minutes in a natural setting decreases activity in the part of the brain associated with rumination, those sticky, unhelpful thoughts. The more green you see, the more space your mind regains. You might find this surprising. John Muir, the writer and naturalist who helped establish the U.S. national parks, suffered from eye injuries in his 20s. Doctors told him to avoid strain. Instead, he climbed mountains. He believed wild places healed not just the body, but the attention itself. He wrote entire essays from memory after long days hiking in silence. There remains considerable disagreement about whether nature restores attention because of evolutionary familiarity or simply because it removes distractions. Some scientists say it's the fractal patterns in trees and clouds that soothe the brain. Others say it's about low-stimulation environments allowing the prefrontal cortex to recharge. Either way, the 19th century writers didn't need to split hairs. They just went outside. And they went often. William Wordsworth composed most of his poetry while walking the hills around Grasmere. His sister, Dorothy, kept a journal of their outdoor wanderings, describing the feel of moss underfoot, the curve of a fern. Those pages are as meditative as the poems they inspired. For them, nature wasn't separate from writing. It was the process. Here's an oddball detail. Beatrix Potter, before she became famous for Peter Rabbit, spent hours sketching mushrooms, trees, and animal bones in the Lake District. Her studies, as she called them, weren't just artistic practice. They were ways to slow down, observe, and sync her thoughts with something real. You don't need a forest. Even a park bench or a potted plant will do. Attention doesn't need grandeur. It needs green. Try this. Before your next creative session, look out a window for 2 minutes. Watch the sky shift. Notice the shapes of leaves. Let your brain rest its weight in the quiet of those patterns. That's the principle behind attention restoration theory, coined by environmental psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. It posits that natural environments engage the brain in a gentle, involuntary way that allows focused attention to recover. It's like putting your mind in a hammock. Even urban 19th century writers found ways to tap into it. Charles Dickens, for all his city ramblings, often ended up in parks or along the Thames. He wasn't just wandering. He was resetting. Taking in natural light. Letting his imagination refill. Philosophers have long debated whether nature is inherently calming or whether we've simply been conditioned to see it that way. But the focus benefits are measurable. Pulse rates drop. Cortisol decreases. Working memory improves. And if you're staring at too many tabs right now, all that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Something you'll want to know. Leo Tolstoy had a forest path he walked every day, rain or shine. Sometimes he'd speak aloud to himself. Sometimes he'd stop and listen to the wind. His family joked that father's brain lives under the trees. They weren't wrong. Even when they couldn't be in nature, writers brought it in. Emily Dickinson kept a herbarium, a pressed flower collection, and often wrote with freshly cut blooms on her desk. She once said, "To make a prairie, it takes a clover and 1 bee. Just a little nature. Just enough to soften the edges of the mind." So how can you bring that into your life? Start small. Open a window. Take your notebook outside, even if it's just your front step. Water a plant with your morning coffee. Keep a rock or seashell on your desk, not for decoration, but for grounding. Let it remind you that thought is physical. That clarity grows best where things live. If you have access to a garden, great. If not, walk where the sky is visible. Look up. Let the motion of clouds or the shift of light reframe your thoughts. You're not losing time, you're recharging your cognitive battery. And if the weather's awful? Open a nature video. Listen to rain sounds. Studies show even simulated nature has focus-enhancing effects. Your brain isn't picky. It just wants peace. After a while, you'll notice the shift. Thoughts slow. Distractions fall away. That thing you've been circling in your head? It gets clearer. And suddenly, the next step in your creative path reveals itself. Because once your mind has had a breath of green air, it's ready to slip back into silence, into the intentional absence of noise that so many 19th century writers cherished. You come back inside. It's quiet, too quiet, maybe. No music. No podcast. Just the soft whir of your own thoughts, and maybe the occasional hum of a refrigerator. And here's the moment where most people reach for something, anything, to fill the space. But the 19th century writers? They leaned in. They embraced the silence. Because they knew that in the absence of noise, focus can finally breathe. We forget how noisy our lives are. Not just sound, but digital chatter, social media scrolls, alerts, the non-stop drip of headlines and commentary. But 19th century writers lived in a world without any of that. Silence wasn't rare. It was default. And that baseline of quiet shaped their ability to concentrate. Take Nathaniel Hawthorne. He worked in long stretches of silence, often alone in a room with nothing but the scratch of his pen and the creak of his chair. When visitors came unannounced, he was known to quietly disappear, literally slipping out the back door. It wasn't rude. It was self-preservation. He guarded his quiet like treasure. And science agrees with him. A 2013 study published in the journal Brain, Structure and Function found that 2 hours of silence per day actually leads to the development of new brain cells in the hippocampus, the region associated with memory, emotion, and learning. Silence doesn't just reduce stress. It rewires you. A weird but true tidbit, the poet Rainer Maria Rilke rented a castle in Duino where he could write undisturbed. The entire property was perched above crashing sea waves, natural noise, sure, but no human voices. He even had a special bell he'd ring to signal that he needed total quiet. No one was to speak to him until it stopped. There remains considerable disagreement about whether total silence is optimal for deep work. Some people thrive with ambient noise, others can't think straight without it. But for the 19th century crowd, silence wasn't negotiable, it was necessary. A condition of thought, not a preference. Even composers like Chopin, who needed to hear every note, carved out blocks of silence where they didn't play anything. These weren't lazy pauses. They were fertile ground. They knew something was happening in the silence that couldn't happen with sound. Believe it or not, Emily Dickinson wrote many of her poems in near total silence. She once described noise as a foreign tongue. She craved stillness so much that when her home became too loud, she'd retreat into her bedroom, put a pillow over her lap, and write facing the wall, blocking even visual noise. Now, think about your own environment. How often do you sit in pure, unfiltered quiet? No background music. No videos playing faintly on a second screen. No phone within reach. Probably not often. And yet, your brain is starving for that space. You don't have to move to a castle or barricade your office. But you can start practicing intentional silence. Set a 20-minute block where you do something focused in total quiet. No headphones. No murmuring playlists. Just your thoughts, and the sound of the world existing without commentary. It might be uncomfortable at first. That's normal. You've trained your mind to expect noise. But give it a few sessions, and you'll notice something fascinating. Your inner dialogue gets clearer. The clutter drops away. What's left is thought in high resolution. Philosophers have long debated the role of silence in cognition. Is it merely a backdrop, or is it an active participant in thought formation? Is the absence of input what allows true insight to form? The 19th century writers lived that debate. And their work, so layered, so internally rich, suggests that silence wasn't passive. It was powerful. And it wasn't always comfortable silence. Leo Tolstoy often wrote late at night when the house was asleep. The creaking of the floorboards was the only companion. He claimed that darkness and silence opened his mind in ways no conversation ever could. That's when the real work happened. Not in salons. In solitude. Did you know this? Charles Darwin, during the peak of his research, asked his family not to speak to him until after lunch. Entire mornings passed in silence. He wasn't being cold. He was defending the mental stillness required to build a theory that would change the world. Even the architecture of the time encouraged quiet. Writing rooms were often tucked into attics or corners far from the bustle of kitchens and parlors. Heavy drapes, thick rugs, and closed doors weren't just for warmth. They were buffers. Barriers against the chaos of the outside world. So how can you bring some of that into your world? Start with the smallest silence, 5 minutes. Turn off everything. Sit down. Breathe. No goal, no task. Just stillness. Once that feels less like punishment and more like peace, try working in that silence. You'll feel your brain stretch. Settle. Soften. And if you're in a noisy home or city, use earplugs. Noise-canceling headphones, turned off. Create a pocket of quiet. You don't need monastic conditions. You just need space for your thoughts to echo. Here's another weird but true finding. Gustave Flaubert once wrote that he couldn't begin a paragraph if there was a ticking clock in the room. He'd literally remove the clock from the wall or stop it before sitting down. Silence wasn't a luxury. It was his oxygen. Because silence isn't empty. It's full. Full of the thoughts you can't hear when everything else is shouting. And once you've found that still, soundless space, your rituals can begin. The ones that tell your brain, it's time to go deeper. You sit in that precious silence. The kind that feels thick, almost sacred. And then, almost instinctively, you reach for something, a candle, a notebook, maybe just the familiar clink of your favorite mug. It's not superstition. It's not even habit. It's a ritual. And 19th century writers were masters of it. To them, ritual wasn't about mysticism. It was about rhythm. Repetition. Signaling the brain, through small, consistent acts, it's time to focus now. You probably already have rituals without realizing it. Stirring your tea exactly 3 times, opening a blank document the same way, cracking your knuckles before you begin. These actions are your brain's way of stepping onto the creative stage. Take Charlotte Bronte. She was known to tidy her entire writing area before starting. Ink pots cleaned. Papers aligned. Quills sharpened. It wasn't about being neat. It was about transition. The physical world shifting to make space for the inner one. And psychology loves this. A 2016 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes found that rituals, even arbitrary ones, improve performance by reducing anxiety and increasing perceived control. Translation: your little quirks might be the very thing keeping you grounded. Here's a fun little twist. Charles Dickens had a precise pre-writing routine. Every morning, he arranged 5 specific objects on his desk: a paper knife, a blue vase with fresh flowers, a figurine, and 2 bronze seals. He didn't start until they were perfectly in place. If even one was missing, he couldn't write. There remains considerable disagreement about whether rituals are empowering psychological tools or mere coping mechanisms. Some psychologists argue that relying on them too much creates dependency. Others see them as self-stabilizing behaviors that help regulate emotional energy. Either way, the 19th century writers clearly knew rituals work. And they weren't all elaborate. Emily Dickinson would stand by the same window every morning, gazing at her garden before picking up her pencil. Herman Melville lit the same oil lamp every night, placing it exactly 1 hand length to the left of his notebook. These acts were quiet, personal, and deeply anchoring. Here's a strange little side note. Friedrich Schiller kept a drawer full of rotting apples in his writing desk. He claimed the scent helped him concentrate. His wife, understandably, disagreed. But he swore the musty smell stirred something essential in his brain. Proof that a ritual doesn't have to make sense, it just has to work for you. So here's the question: what small acts could become your rituals? Lighting a candle? Starting with a poem? Putting on the same sweater every writing session? These aren't distractions. They're thresholds. They mark the passage between everyday life and focused work. Think of them like runway lights guiding your brain toward takeoff. And the beauty of ritual is that it reduces decision fatigue. When your pre-work process becomes automatic, your brain doesn't waste energy wondering what to do next. It already knows. Cue the coffee. Cue the silence. Cue the focus. Philosophers have long debated the difference between ritual and routine. Is it just repetition, or is there meaning layered underneath? The 19th century writers might say, both. A ritual is a routine with soul. With intention. With just enough poetry to bring the mind to attention. Even when life was chaotic, writers leaned on these rituals like lifeboats. Jane Austen had to write in shared spaces, amid clattering dishes and conversation. But she still placed a small blotting pad on her table every time she wrote. That tiny square of paper became her focus portal. You don't need incense and Gregorian chants. You need consistency. And you need it to be yours. Not a Pinterest productivity list. Not someone else's ritual. Yours. Try building one this week. Choose 3 small actions to start every deep focus session. Maybe it's dimming a light. Turning off your phone. Stretching your fingers. It doesn't matter what. What matters is meaning. A small, quirky twist. Mark Twain always wrote while lying in bed, propped up by pillows, with his legs stretched out and papers spread across his lap. He said it helped him think better, and insisted on complete silence while he wrote. This reclining ritual didn't hinder his output. It fueled it. And rituals aren't limited to starting work, they can end it, too. Many 19th century writers had exit routines. George Eliot would close her notebook, seal it in a drawer, and take a walk to clear her head. Trollope would mark the end of a session with a cup of tea and exactly 15 minutes of silence. These weren't add-ons. They were part of the mental hygiene of focus. So what's your exit ritual? Is it closing your laptop? Stepping outside? Taking a deep breath and rolling your shoulders? Find it. Honor it. Let your mind know, we're done now. You can rest. Because rituals protect your mental energy. They build a bridge into focus, and out of it. They're the difference between stumbling through your work and stepping in with intention. And once those rituals are in place, those tiny, sacred acts that say now we begin, you're ready for the hard part. The part most people avoid. The part the 19th century writers actually cherished. The deep, focused, surgical art of rewriting. You finish your draft, set down your pen, maybe even stretch your arms with the quiet pride of, I made a thing. But then comes the part you dread, the rereading, the slashing, the reshaping. The rewriting. In a world addicted to speed and, publish now, revision feels like a slowdown. But to 19th century writers? Rewriting was where the real focus began. They didn't just tolerate revision. They honored it. Protected it. Immersed themselves in it like sculptors returning to the same block of marble. Because to them, the first draft wasn't the work. It was the invitation to go deeper. Take Gustave Flaubert, patron saint of obsessive revision. He could spend an entire week polishing a single paragraph. He'd read sentences aloud to hear their cadence. He'd pace, mutter, and rewrite the same line 20 times, sometimes with fresh ink, sometimes with his own blood pressure rising. This wasn't perfectionism for the sake of it. It was focus. Pure, patient, precise focus. Modern psychology has a term for this, cognitive perseverance, the mental stamina required to stay with a complex task through multiple iterations. A 2018 study in cognition and emotion showed that people who view mistakes as opportunities for refinement, rather than signs of failure, are more likely to develop sustained attention during revision-based tasks. A little surprise for you, Charles Dickens was an aggressive self-editor. He regularly cut full chapters from his novels before publication. In one particularly brutal revision session, he removed a 30-page subplot from Bleak House. His reason? It did not deserve the reader's time. Now that's a focus flex. There remains considerable disagreement about how much rewriting is too much. Some argue that endless editing kills the spontaneity of first thoughts. Others claim that revision is where real voice emerges. The 19th century writers didn't see a conflict, they just rewrote until the work clicked. Did you know? Henry James famously dictated late drafts of his novels to a typist. But he'd revised the transcriptions so heavily, with margin notes, new sentences, arrows, and scrawls, that the final product often looked like a coded map. His mind was always folding and unfolding the narrative until it reached a precise tension. So, what made rewriting such a focus magnet? First, it narrowed the field. You weren't facing an empty page. You had material. Raw thoughts, tangled sentences, word soup. Revision gave the brain something to shape rather than summon from nothing. Second, it forced engagement. Rereading your own work isn't passive. It's evaluative. You're constantly questioning, testing, noticing. That friction, between what's there and what could be, is where deep attention thrives. Try this, the next time you write something, an email, a caption, a journal entry, go back and rewrite it. Not to improve it for someone else. Just to practice returning. You'll feel the difference in your brain. A kind of click. A grounding. Philosophers still argue whether thought is best captured raw or refined. Should writing express the spontaneity of emotion or the discipline of clarity? The 19th century writers built bridges between the two. First draft, heart. Second draft, spine. And they weren't gentle. Emily Dickinson revised obsessively, sometimes writing 4 or 5 versions of the same line in her fascicles, those little sewn-together poem booklets. Some versions differed by only a word, but that word made the poem's whole gravity shift. Even non-literary 19th century thinkers embraced this slow sharpening. Charles Darwin took 20 years to revise his notes before publishing On the Origin of Species. He tested each idea against new evidence. Reread letters. Redrafted entire theories. His editing process wasn't procrastination. It was methodical evolution. Louisa May Alcott, pressed by deadlines and publishers, often wrote her first drafts quickly, but she still insisted on 2 personal revisions before handing in a manuscript. She called them her truth passes. The first draft told the story. The second told the truth. So how can you bring this into your life? Start with time. Build revision into your schedule. Don't treat it like an emergency patch-up. Treat it like a second phase. Set a block, just like the writing block, entirely for review. Even 15 minutes helps. Don't aim to fix everything. Aim to listen to your own words again. Then, go smaller. Choose one sentence and rewrite it 5 different ways. Focus not on meaning, but on rhythm. On voice. Notice how your attention tightens. How your internal editor wakes up not to scold, but to sculpt. A weird but true tidbit, Leo Tolstoy wrote 7 complete drafts of War and Peace. That's not a typo. 7. And the final version? 1,200 pages. He didn't rewrite because he was unsure. He rewrote because he was relentless in serving the idea, not his ego. That's what revision does. It takes the self out of the way. You're no longer the performer. You're the craftsman. The editor. The caretaker of clarity. And that role demands full focus. And once you've tasted that, once you've sat with the same page for the 5th time and felt something click into place, you'll never see rewriting as tedious again. You'll see it as sacred. Because in that slow, repetitive burn, you find the brightest concentration of all. And yet, even in that sacred space, distractions can come. The pull of recognition. The flicker of applause. The desire to be seen. The 19th century writers wrestled with that, too. Which leads us into the next room, a quieter one, where fame itself becomes the greatest distraction of all. You finish your edits. The piece is tighter, cleaner, maybe even beautiful. You should feel proud. And maybe you do. But then comes the itch, will anyone read this? Should I post it now? What if no one likes it? That need to be seen, to be acknowledged, rushes in. But for many 19th century writers, this was the moment they stepped back. Because they knew something we keep forgetting, attention given to you often steals attention from the work. It's a strange truth. The deeper your focus becomes, the less you crave outside approval. And the moment you start chasing validation, likes, praise, shares, that focus begins to dissolve. The 19th century writers weren't saints. But many of them resisted fame or retreated from it. Not because they were shy. Because they knew distraction wears many masks, and one of the most seductive is recognition. Take Emily Dickinson. She published fewer than a dozen poems during her lifetime, most anonymously or without her permission. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems, folded them into private booklets, and kept them in a drawer. To her, writing was communion, not performance. She didn't need the world's applause. She needed the page. Modern psychology nods knowingly here. A 2019 study in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin found that external rewards can actually diminish intrinsic motivation over time. The more you focus on how your work is received, the less connected you become to why you started it in the first place. Here's a twist you didn't expect. Franz Kafka begged his friend Max Brod to burn all his manuscripts after he died. That included the trial, the castle, and America. Brod, thankfully, ignored him. But Kafka's impulse wasn't self-hatred. It was purity. He wrote for the process, not for permanence. There remains considerable disagreement about whether fame enhances or disrupts artistic focus. Some say the visibility sharpens discipline. Others say it splinters attention. But for 19th century writers like Thoreau, Austen, and the Brontes, focus wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing deeply. Charlotte Bronte published Jane Eyre under the pen name Currer Bell. She didn't want her gender, or her family's modest status, to distract from the story. Her sister Emily published Wuthering Heights as Ellis Bell. Their books only found their readers after the truth came out, and by then, the writing was long finished. Just a quirky detail, Nathaniel Hawthorne burned his early short stories before becoming famous. Why? He thought fame had made him lazy. He wanted to return to writing with the hunger of obscurity. Think about that for a second. He erased his past work to reclaim his focus. Today, it's hard to separate work from identity. Your name is your brand. Your output is your currency. And if something doesn't get noticed, it feels like it didn't matter. But the 19th century writers would gently disagree. Fame didn't define the value of their focus. Work did. Henry David Thoreau said, "Would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to myself than be crowded on a velvet cushion." Replace pumpkin with your creative solitude, and you get the idea. He knew that attention from others can quickly turn into noise. Here's something interesting. Jane Austen's books were originally published by a lady. No name. No interviews. No press tour. She wrote, revised, and published while caring for her family, managing a household, and enduring long periods of illness. And yet her work endures, not because of her visibility, but because of her vision. Philosophers still argue whether creative work is best done in the dark or under a spotlight. Does obscurity protect your focus, or does public pressure refine it? The 19th century writers seem to lean toward shadows, where the mind could stretch without performance anxiety. And even those who did become famous often regretted it. Lord Byron, hailed across Europe, called fame a nuisance. Charles Dickens once disguised himself in public to escape recognition, tired of the endless questions and attention. It wasn't modesty, it was exhaustion. Attention scattered his thoughts. He needed the quiet again. So how do you protect your focus from the hunger to be noticed? Start by separating creation from sharing. Write the piece, paint the thing, solve the problem before you think about how it'll be received. Hold it in your hands as yours first, not the world's. Let it live with you for a while. Let the applause, if it comes, be extra. Not essential. Try this, go a week without posting anything you make. Journal it. Write longhand. Draft a piece and save it to a folder called Private Work. Feel what it's like to create just for yourself. The focus that returns might surprise you. And if you do want to share, that's fine too. But know why you're doing it. If it's for connection, great. If it's for approval, pause. Check if you're still centered in the work, or drifting away from it. A quirky side note, Leo Tolstoy, after War and Peace and Anna Karenina, renounced his royalties. He turned away from fame entirely, grew a beard that made him look like a monk, and started publishing spiritual tracts for free. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He just wanted the noise to stop. Because in the end, fame is just another voice in the room. And the more voices there are, the harder it is to hear your own. So take a breath. Let the world be quiet. Let the work be yours again. And when you're ready, when your focus has been defended against distraction, approval, and ego, there's one more space to protect. The space where burnout begins. The place where boundaries must be drawn. That quiet threshold between work and rest. You're tired. Not just sleepy, but that deeper kind of tired, the one that hums beneath your eyes, curls in your shoulders, makes your thoughts dull around the edges. You've been focusing, producing, pushing. And now comes the part that 19th century writers approached with surprising wisdom, the need for rest, for balance, for boundaries that protect not just time, but attention itself. We often imagine them as relentless, Dickens churning out serialized novels, the Brontes scribbling through grief, Tolstoy wrestling with epics. But what's often overlooked is how many of them stopped. Not forever, but with intention. With awareness. Because they understood something we forget, even the mind needs maintenance. Take William Wordsworth. He spent nearly as much time walking and staring into the distance as he did writing. He wasn't procrastinating. He was restoring. He once wrote that poetry takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Not chaos. Tranquility. Modern psychology calls this cognitive replenishment, the process of giving your brain time to reset after high-focus tasks. A 2016 study in Trends in Neurosciences showed that mental fatigue isn't just a feeling, it's a physical state. Without downtime, attention depletes. Creativity collapses. Memory fragments. You might find this surprising. George Eliot would stop mid-sentence if she sensed mental fatigue. She'd leave the desk, take a walk, or lie down with a book she'd already read 100 times. She wasn't being lazy. She was protecting the quality of her focus, not just its quantity. There remains considerable disagreement about how much rest a focused mind actually needs. Some researchers argue for 90-minute ultradian cycles. Others say longer gaps between deep work are necessary. But the 19th century writers weren't charting biorhythms. They were listening to themselves. And they knew when the tank was empty. A weird little bonus, Charles Darwin scheduled his days in small chunks. He worked in short, deep bursts, then stopped to walk, nap, or have tea. His afternoons were reserved almost entirely for rest. Yet in those few working hours, he rewrote the story of life on Earth. Proof that more hours doesn't equal more insight. So how do you recognize burnout before it eats your focus alive? First, pay attention to friction. If starting your usual routine feels like lifting concrete, if your sentences begin to feel hollow, if your rituals start to fail, you're not broken. You're just burned out. Burnout doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. A slow erosion of joy. A faint resentment toward things you once loved. A quiet ache behind your eyes. And 19th century writers were not immune. Emily Bronte wrote with astonishing intensity, but after completing Wuthering Heights, she withdrew almost entirely. Some say exhaustion played a role. Louisa May Alcott collapsed after finishing Little Women, needing months to recover. She described her exhaustion as a wall of fog in the mind. Sound familiar? Philosophers have long debated whether the best work is born from struggle or from serenity. Do we have to suffer to create? Or can good work come from balance and well-being? The 19th century writers lived somewhere between. They knew suffering, but they also built rest into their routines as armor. Leo Tolstoy often stopped writing for weeks, even months, at a time. Not because he lacked ideas, but because he refused to write through emptiness. I must recover the heart of it, he said. The soul cannot be forced. So what does balance look like for you? It might mean not finishing the draft tonight. It might mean going to bed instead of rereading for the 10th time. It might mean taking a walk without thinking about the next project. Letting your attention untangle. Try this, set boundaries around your deep work. Not just a start time, but an end. Let your brain know when to stop. No matter how inspired you feel, leave something undone. Let tomorrow's self pick it up. And create buffers between focus and life. Don't leap from deep concentration into social media doomscrolls or noisy rooms. Take a quiet minute. Close your notebook. Stretch. Put on soft music. Let the transition be gentle. A weird little bonus? Virginia Woolf, slightly later than the 19th century, but shaped by it, had a ritual of drifting after writing, sitting by the fire, staring into space, sipping tea with no conversation. She believed the thoughts needed time to sink in properly. That's rest as integration, not absence. Because rest isn't laziness. It's preparation. For the next idea. The next sentence. The next moment of attention that's about to bloom. You don't need to earn it. You don't need to apologize for it. You just need to receive it. As part of the process. As part of the pattern. As part of the focus you're slowly reclaiming from a world that keeps trying to break it. And now that we've walked through their mornings, their tools, their walks and silences, now that we've opened every drawer and lit every metaphorical candle with these writers from another century, let's pause. Just for a moment longer. Because here, at the end of our journey, you've earned something gentle. Let's wind it all down. So now, you breathe. A little slower. A little deeper. Let your shoulders fall. Let your eyes rest on whatever's still. A flickering lamp, a corner of ceiling, the warm blur of blankets. Wherever you are, you've arrived. You've walked beside the quiet minds of another time. You've watched the sunrise with Tolstoy. Heard the pencil scratch under Dickinson's hand. Stepped into the woods with Thoreau. Each of them reaching for the same thing you are, stillness, clarity, focus. Not the sharp kind. Not the kind that strains and flexes. The other kind, the one that feels like warm water, a steady flame, a breath you didn't know you were holding. And here's what you know now, tucked gently into your thoughts like folded letters. That small rituals matter. That nature remembers you. That silence is not empty. That writing by hand can slow your racing thoughts. That boundaries aren't walls, they're gardens. That rewriting is a return, not a punishment. That fame is a loud room, but focus is a locked door. And above all, that even in a noisy, rushing, pixel-lit world, you can still find your way back. Back to the quiet desk. Back to the first line. Back to yourself. So tonight, close your notebook. Power down the lights. Let everything be unfinished, just for a little while. The words will wait. The page will still be here. And if your thoughts drift, let them. If your eyes flutter, let them. You've done enough for today. Let's slowly drift into tonight's quiet moments together.